Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. In this week's episode, we're talking about a newsletter that quickly became a must-read for people who work in the space industry. When everyday people hear about space-related news, it's usually in association with an organization like NASA or SpaceX. But while Elon Musk is great at grabbing headlines, the space industry actually comprises a vast constellation of companies that generate hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And it's only set to expand. Morgan Stanley projects it'll reach $1.25 trillion by 2040. Given the size and growth of this industry, it's probably a surprise to no one who listens to this podcast that there's an enormous opportunity for the B2B media outlets that cover it. One of the most exciting entrants into that space is Payload, a daily newsletter that launched in 2021. Though Payload was bootstrapped for its first several months, it announced a $650,000 seed round last year that was led by Winklevoss Capital, the venture firm run by Cameron and Tyler Winklevoss. It's since hired an editorial staff and landed its first major sponsors. Payload was founded by Mo Islam and Ari Lewis, and in December 2021, I interviewed Mo about the newsletter's origin, its audience development strategy, and its plans to monetize its influential readership. Before we jump into the interview, I want to talk about our sponsor. Do you want to set yourself up to sell your media company down the line? Check out the They Got Acquired newsletter, which helps entrepreneurs sell their business. They share advice on how to position your company for a sale and how to find the right buyer. But the most exciting part is their database. They're tracking acquisitions of online businesses and sharing that data with entrepreneurs who want to sell, so you can better understand how much your company is worth. They focus on the smaller end of the market, so these are sales in the 6, 7, and low 8-figure range. In the last few weeks, they've featured The Hustle, which was sold to HubSpot, The Charlotte Agenda, which is a newsletter that was sold to Axios, and a handful of other newsletter companies. The best way to access this information is through their newsletter at theygotaacquired.com/newsletter. That's theygotaacquired.com/newsletter. I'll leave a link in the description. Okay, now on to my interview with Mo. Hey Mo, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Simon. Excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
So you're the co-founder of a space industry newsletter called Payload, but your background is originally in finance, right?
Correct. That's right.
Yeah. So what were you doing prior to co-founding this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I spent most of my career on Wall Street. I was there close to a decade and spent most of it at JP Morgan. I was at JP Morgan for about 7 years and then Deutsche Bank for 2 of them. And I held roles across both public and private markets, but notably spent a pretty significant part of my career at both organizations raising and investing capital in private technology businesses. And I focused a lot of my time on deep tech or emerging tech, frontier tech. I know folks call it a number of different things, but basically
What is
businesses.
that?
So basically it's businesses where there's a science and engineering risk to getting the idea to actually work, right? It's very different from a software business where it's all about product market fit. This is all about, does the product that this business or service that the business offering, does it actually physically work? So I worked on a variety of different industries, but space actually was one of my coverage areas. And I spent a great deal of time writing research, dissecting business models, and we were raising capital and investing capital in these businesses. And the reason why the payload idea sort of came to fruition was mainly because of my experience on the research side of things. One of the frustrations that I had was I just couldn't find enough news coverage and news flow on new space. I think none of the banks at the time, none of the investment banks were covering the industry from a research perspective. And that was mainly because there's no perceived investment banking revenue from covering kind of new space at the time. So no one was covering it. And I think there were a lot of great outlets in the industry covering space news and industry news, but I think it was a bit more focused on traditional aerospace and defense. And the cadence, I think, in which they were covering some of those news stories didn't really match up in my mind to sort of the capital flow and just the growth that was happening in the industry, both on the investor side and on sort of the company formation side. So to me, it was really abundantly clear that this industry was growing very quickly. The pace of growth and the size of market was quite significant, and that it was big enough to support multiple media players. So, we decided to, I partnered with my co-founder, Ari Lewis, and we decided to build a space-focused B2B digital media company from the ground up.
And so when we talk about space, like some people listening to this, they might think of like NASA and then a handful of private companies like SpaceX, but there's actually like a vast space industry, right? Like you
Correct.
think about satellites, all kinds of stuff like that.
Yeah, no, we could talk about this for hours. There's so much going on, and there's a lot of different, I would say, forecasts out there for how big the industry is today and how big it will become. People put it in the order of 200. I guess the estimates I've seen is like 200 to 350, 400 billion currently. And you have the Wall Street analysts now coming out saying that it's in the multiple trillions. I've seen on the high end in the next decade,
What will
next decade or
drive it
two.
to be in the trillions? Like what kind of why is it going towards that direction?
Well, so if you really kind of take a step back, there are a number of things that have happened, disruptive, I think, innovations that have happened in the industry that have led to this mass proliferation of new business models. And we can get into it. I think if you think that your listeners would appreciate it, but I think to kind of summarize, the first is just the launch costs. Musk has helped drop launch costs significantly through rocket reusability. There's also been this vast commoditization of satellite manufacturing. So the cost to build a satellite, the associated sensors, buses, all the hardware, that's dropped quite significantly. There's been a shift in the way NASA thinks about contract awards, and it's been very bullish for spending in the private sector. NASA has basically said, hey, there's more innovation happening in the private sector. So rather than us build it, why don't we outsource this and like actually become customers of the commercial space industry? And of course, you have the space race, right? You have like the new space race that I think we're witnessing firsthand between the U.S. and China, which is very real and it's driving a lot of growth on both ends. But to go back to your original question, where is most of that growth happening? It's really happening, I think, in the satellite industry. So Earth observation, communication, connectivity. You have Starlink, of course, building in Amazon with Kuiper, building out mass satellite broadband constellations to provide internet kind of anywhere in the world, and provide more internet access to places in the world where it's not easy to access. So most of that, I think, growth is happening really on the satellite kind of communications and connectivity side. But of course, there's like other, I would say, I don't want to call it moonshot, but other massive industries that I think will continue to drive that. The idea that we are going to go to the moon and Mars pretty soon, and exploration, and sort of like, I mean, you could very quickly create and back into a pretty sizable addressable market, but I still think that there's many years away. The near term growth in the market is really happening in low Earth orbit, so right above Earth.
So a mixture of space tourism and every single industry finding new uses for satellites.
Yeah, I mean, tourism. So it's interesting you bring up tourism. I think tourism is fascinating, and I am sort of in the camp of I love what Bezos and Branson are doing, and I think they've reignited a lot of consumer interest in space, which is obviously great for media. But the as a size of the greater industry and sort of everything we're talking about in terms of where we think the space industry is going to go, tourism is going to be a tiny, tiny, almost insignificant part of it. But it's going to drive them a lot of headlines, right? You're going to have interesting figures go up into space doing cool things and interesting things. So that's always going to drive a lot of the headlines. But there's no question that from the perspective of how much attention it grabs versus how much revenue it generates for the industry, there's a clear mismatch. So I'd say space tourism is a pretty small part of what we're kind of talking about.
And how did you meet your co-founder Ari Lewis?
Yeah, so it's kind of a random story. It was while I was at JP Morgan, it was about 6 years ago, I want to say. Ari at the time was heavily involved in the crypto industry. He was an early investor in some of these really interesting crypto projects. And I was yeah, his cousin I worked with very closely at JP Morgan, and he he said to me, and I was doing research on a lot of sort of, I'd say, frontier technologies, and crypto obviously fell into that. He was like, "Hey, you need to meet my cousin. He's talking about this like Bitcoin thing." This was like late 2016, by the way. He's talking about this like Bitcoin thing. Like, you need to talk to him because I don't know, but he sounds like, there's something there. So we bring him into the office, and Ari and I ended up spending like a couple hours together that day. And really the takeaway, there's two takeaways I had. One, oh, like what's happening in crypto is like real, and we need to like spend some time on it and focus on it. But the bigger piece of it is like, I was like, wow, this guy's like really smart. I was like, he's a number of years younger than me, but he just like has a tremendous grasp over what's happening here. And we just stayed in touch. And I think he was involved in media for a little bit. He founded a tech association, one of the largest tech associations in Ohio, and we just stayed in touch. And he was a writer for Crane's Cleveland. He'd started his own podcast, and then I was telling him a lot of sort of about a little over a year ago. I was telling him about all the things I was witnessing in the space industry, and we'd kind of come to the conclusion together, wow, like there could potentially be a business here. We're also seeing like what was happening in the media space in general, the Morning Brews of the world, the Axioses of the world, the newsletter-centric, newsletter-first media models that have come out and have started to gain a lot of traction, both on the advertising side and the consumer side. So he said, why don't we bring that model to space? Because it's lacking, and we know space is going to be a big industry. We know there's going to be new readership from like new entrants, new entrepreneurs, new employees that enter the industry. So we should really kind of think about how to build a business here.
And so you wanted to create like a morning brew like thing for the space industry. Did you guys both like quit your jobs at the same time? And how did you, especially in those early days, decide who was going to be writing it and different stuff like that?
Yeah, well, mainly, so yes, we were, I was the de facto writer for quite some time, and Ari was really focused on growth and audience development, and part of the reason why I was I am not a journalist, and it's a miracle that we were able to even get subscribers at the time, because quite honestly, I think my writing is pretty horrible. But I'm a research writer, right? I write to provide facts, and
Mhm.
facts and analysis, and research can be dry, right? So for me in the very beginning, it was a bit of a struggle. Like, how do I write in a voice that's really interesting and exciting, and sort of tells the story of what we're trying to do here? So in the beginning, it was really just me writing, and Ari focused on our audience growth development, and we knew we needed to get someone who had experience writing for newsletter to join the team. So one of the companies that we were honing in on was Morning Brew, right? And we had identified a gentleman named Ryan Duffy, who was one of the main writers for the Emerging Tech Brew, which was one of their most successful verticals, and he helped build it and was a huge part of it, part of growing it to the massive subscriber base that it's grown to. So we were like, we got to figure out a way to get Ryan, because he'd be perfect for this. And in his writing, we were like, he also clearly has an interest for space. So we decided that two things we decided. One, we knew we needed to take the newsletter from weekly to daily,
Okay,
because we
so
wanted.
we're getting too far ahead of ourselves.
Sure.
So when did the newsletter launch?
It was about a year ago now. It was, I want to say, September was when we sent like the first prototype to like 50 people.
Yeah, and so you're writing it each week. Did you quit your job, or you were just doing this as like a side
We
thing?
were doing it on the side.
Uh-huh. So you're writing it once a week, and what does it look like? It has like kind of like you think Morning Brew, like three or four stories with kind of punchy writing, kind of summarizing why they're important, something like that.
Well, in the beginning, we were actually just focused on aggregation. So in the
Uh-huh.
very, very
Yeah.
beginning stages, right, like the first like few months, we were like, we don't need to write anything original right now, because we know that what's missing in the industry is just like a really great weekly piece that sums up, what all the news was for the week. And most importantly, because we were focused on the business of space, we were like, we need to cover the financings, like what companies have raised money, who is going public, what type of like merger or acquisition is occurring. We're like, let's just summarize all those things in a weekly newsletter, and that's what we did in the very beginning. And we started to gain a lot of traction. Like I think 2 months into it, we got like a number of public company CEOs sign up, and that's when we were like, wait a minute, like are we on to something? This is clearly something that the industry needs. Let's figure out how to build this thing out.
Yeah, and so neither of you had brands in this space in terms of like being known. So how did it start finding an audience? Like Ari was telling me, he just started kind of just basically had this LinkedIn strategy where he was literally just searching for people's names and industries and or their names and roles, and was like adding them on LinkedIn and then sending them a personalized message asking them to sign up.
So there were two things that are happening. So because of my involvement on the investment side, I I had a number of, I think, key connections from the very beginning where we were able to say, hey, we know we're doing this, take a look at it, let us know what you think, right? So that was part of it. And a lot of our early growth did come from just folks forwarding it, and we were able to track that data, who was forwarding it, how many times it was being opened, how many times people were clicking the link to subscribe. And then what Ari discovered, which was pretty smart, for us, was, we were like, where do the space industry people live? Twitter, yes, but you're not going to get a lot of the senior, industry professionals on Twitter. Not always. Now that's changing, and I think there's more of a space Twitter community than there ever has been before today. But in the beginning, we're like, well, they all have LinkedIn's. So like, why don't we reach out to them and just talk about what we're doing and see if that's something interesting to you? So we actually were able to get a lot of high value introductions and conversations, and folks that are still to this day helping us and advising us that, occurred through LinkedIn. And LinkedIn, I've learned, and this is a really funny like debate that Ari and I, well, not debate, but Ari's been trying to convince me for quite some time, that LinkedIn as a audience acquisition tool is actually pretty powerful. And I've noticed that just by like posting things and how many views it gets and how many folks like it, and the interaction and the engagement, it's just very different from like the other platforms we've used.
So you're writing this weekly newsletter. You're slowly kind of growing an audience, but it's not like growing like super fast. Like I think within, but not that that's bad because it was a very niche and powerful audience. But like, I mean, it was only growing by like 100 new signups per month or something like that, right? It wasn't like some kind of massive morning brew like growth.
No, that's exactly
Yeah,
right. And we weren't expecting to get the massive, morning brew kind of type growth. For us, the way we judged traction was like, hey, how many C-suite people are we getting reading us?
yeah,
And we saw like the hundred, like, let's just use an example because I actually don't know the exact number, but like let's just say the 100 people that were signing up, every so often, like of that 100, probably like 30 people, 40 people were like executives, right? Or like people
yeah.
in very clear leadership roles. So we're like, these are the decision makers we want to reach. I mean, yeah, it'd be amazing to get 1,000 people that work at SpaceX, right? That's obviously what we
Mhm.
want. But 1,000 people at SpaceX or 10 like executives or decision makers, I mean, that's when you kind of put on your business hat and you're like, well, from an advertising perspective, what's more valuable?
Hmm. And so you want to go. You realize you got some traction. You're weekly. You said you want to go daily. Also, you weren't like the most talented writer. You wanted to go out and I guess hire this guy from Morning Brew. But to do that, you had to raise money, right?
Yes, that's
Uh
right.
huh. So when did you decide to raise money?
We decided to raise money this past summer because we were having early conversations with, and this was before we decided that we needed to get someone who had very clear newsletter experience. In the very beginning, we were just thinking like, okay, let's see if let's just talk to some people that are in the science community and the space community who are journalists and get a feel for who potentially we'd want or who'd want to join us. And the issue was in the very beginning was, even though you can definitely bootstrap media businesses from the ground up, we started to realize, hey, no one really wanted to join us in the early days without any sense of job security. So we were like, we can't seem to nab the folks that we want to get. So we decided, okay, like raising a round makes a lot of sense. One, because if we raise a small enough round, and we also are very, very careful about what our kind of future rounds look like, right? Because we have a pretty good grasp over like what venture capital and capital in general has done to media companies. We've said like, let's just be very methodical about how we raise money, and like let's figure out how to like build a very small team in the very beginning. So that's what prompted us to raise money, and we started in the summer. And fundraising, part of it was the market. We're in a very pretty good market for capital raising. And the other part of it is I think the industry trends in space helped us, and I think the media trends helped us. But we were able to raise the capital from a lot of very interesting angel investors, and we were very happy with the way that all turned out.
And your pitch was, newsletters are really hot right now. Look at just Morning Brew. The Hustle just had their exits. The space industry is really hot right now. It's 300 billion now, but it's going to be 3 trillion in 10 years. And, nobody's really doing anything in this space. So this is the perfect time to invest in these two hot things.
I would add an addendum to it, which was we were like the advertising market in space is non-existent for the most part, at least outside of the aerospace primes. So we were like, we also feel like we have an opportunity to quite literally create an advertising market here, and what that can grow to, we don't know yet. What our thesis was really simple. Once we own the audience, and we can build a community and a brand, we can really figure out how to drive new revenue channels that might be far outside just the newsletter.
And it was a relatively small raise, right?
Yes, correct. Correct.
Uh-huh. And so I think it's somewhere in the 6 figures. How are you spending that money?
Well, it's going mainly to hiring, right? So
Yeah.
the first hire was Ryan Duffy, who's our founding and managing editor. Our second hire was Rachel Zisk, who's been great, and an amazing addition to the team. And she's our writer. We have a couple other folks that we're thinking of hiring. So really, the capital is mainly going to hiring. It's going out to building out our website and a few other products that we have kind of thinking about launching, sort of like call it end of next year.
And was with Ryan's hiring, did that coincide with the launch of the daily version?
That's right. Exactly. That's exactly right. So once he was hired, and after we had some time to kind of ramp up, we were able to get the daily launched in early October.
And so now that you have a managing editor, writer, how is that changing the format of the newsletter or what you're able to accomplish? Obviously, it be going from weekly to daily is one thing, but is it transforming in terms of like how in depth you can go, original reporting, anything like that?
Yeah, so we have so part of the reason why we switched over from weekly to daily was we wanted to create a habit, right? We wanted folks in the space industry to wake up every single morning and say, if there's one thing I need to read today that tells me everything I need to know, that not only where I can find original reporting. So to answer your question, yes, we have been original. We have been doing our original reporting, thanks to Ryan and Rachel, has ramped up quite significantly, and also just an aggregation of all the other news that's out there and all the other things that people want to know, like who's raised capital this week, who has left, who are the senior people that have left their jobs at one company and joined another, like what's all the things happening this week in the industry, conferences, launches, and we have some other kind of fun stuff to help kind of the audience stay engaged. But really the whole goal of the daily was like to create a habit.
And so it's been a solid 2 months since you launched the daily version. What have you noticed from an audience growth perspective that's done for, expanding your audience and reach and everything like that?
Yeah, so I would say one of the biggest surprises we had when we moved over, when we were moving over to daily, we were a bit worried. We were thinking, okay, we had a weekly newsletter for, I don't know, 8 months. And our audience at that point was very used to seeing a weekly newsletter. And then all of a sudden, we're going to flip a switch and they're going to get 5 newsletters a week. So we're clearly going to get some folks that unsubscribe, especially people who may not have been, who may be like kind of more space tourists, right? We're just kind of casually interested, but don't really care to get a daily email. And then what we witnessed was, yes, we did get some unsubscribes. There's no question about it, but our growth really started to accelerate. So I think it told us that, in fact, the folks in the industry cared more about a daily cadence than they cared about a weekly cadence. So we ended up, our subscriber growth has been actually really good since we moved over to daily. So one, it was definitely the right move. And two, I think it was more valuable to the community.
So there are two kind of philosophies I see with a lot of newsletter startups. Is one is like this is meant to be read in the inbox. If you go to our website, all you see is a landing page with a brief kind of explanation of what you get and a sign up page. Whereas like other companies are taking a lot of their newsletter content and spinning it off as like standalone articles. You see this with Axios, so that it has like a very robust web presence to get people, sharing on social media and kind of in the funnel that way. I notice if you go to just the payload research or whatever the web URL is, like just the main URL, it is nothing but a sign up form. I can't really peruse the archives, but I
Mhm.
found some backdoors where you actually are. But through looking at your Twitter account, I found where you can actually find some of articles and stuff you're pushing. What's your kind of philosophy on terms of like this needs to be read in the inbox versus we're going to publish web content and get some SEO value and social media shares, different stuff like that?
So you're absolutely correct. In the very beginning, we were just a landing page, and we have a backdoor option now. We didn't even have that back then. It was really
Mhm.
just a landing page, and we wanted people to click on the link, and they had to sign up, right? They had no other choice, and we wanted everything to live in the newsletter. But we've started to realize that there's a tremendous value in having uh, readers share what we're writing, right? And it's not easy to share a newsletter, or if there's a particular article, maybe there's a particular interview that someone has done.
Yeah.
So we're actually rebuilding. So we've kind of come to a half solution right now, where there are like you said, there are these sort of backdoor options to get into the article. Like if someone shares an article, you can go onto the site, the part of our site where we list all our articles. But we are actually going through a revamp of our entire website currently, and that's probably going to likely launch in the new year. So, and that's going to be a very different website from what you're seeing right now. And it's going to look a little bit more like your website where you can visit and you can actually go and read the newsletter and the stories directly on the website. But we think that that's not going to necessarily hurt our newsletter growth. If anything, it's going to allow readers and potential readers to share what we're writing, and we're creating different ways for people to be able to sign up pretty naturally and easily.
And so do you anticipate having a more robust like social media strategy and stuff like that once there's more web content to push people to?
That's right. That's exactly right.
Because right now it's pretty anemic. Like you have like what 3,000 followers on Twitter. Do you have like a active Facebook or Instagram or anything like that?
No, we don't have Facebook or Instagram. I mean, part of the reason why we're not really like interested in any of those channels is that's just not where the space community lives. And from an advertising perspective, like something like we've all seen the stats of like something like 40% of funding goes to the advertising giants. But if you're in the space industry and you've raised this enormous amount of venture capital, which is what's happening, you have to advertise. You can't go to Google and Facebook. So we're not particularly keen on Instagram or Facebook quite yet. I'd say that TikTok is definitely a medium that we're thinking about significantly and thinking about what it could look like and what it could mean. And there's a lot of great space influencers, actually, not that many, but there are a few really good space influencers that live on TikTok. So that is a medium that we're thinking about. But yeah, I mean, we haven't really, if I'm being honest, we haven't really turned on the taps on any significant user acquisition strategies on the social side or on the newsletter side. We were sort of letting it grow somewhat organically. And we're waiting for two things. One, we're waiting for the website to be done and dusted because we're going to start integrating referral tools. And that's something that Morning Brew did so well, and was able to, they were able to capture a significant amount of audience growth through those referral tools. So we're going to be integrating more of those types of like audience acquisition strategies, and I would assume that that's going to help drive our growth. And of course, we also have the tailwind that every month that goes by, more and more people are interested in the space community. So um,
And have there been anything like that have caused big spikes in new signups? Obviously, switching to daily probably did, but like, is it when if there's like a piece of breaking news or something like that? Have you seen any kind of like some influencer pick it up on Twitter or something, and there are any big spikes?
yeah, exclusives always help. We had a article recently, and it's escaping me what the topic was, but we had an article fairly recently that drove multiple thousands of people onto our website, and we didn't have a way to sign them up. So everyone was coming onto the website and seeing the article, and there was for two things.
There was
One,
no call to action.
there was no call to action, right? And that spoke to what we were saying was like, we knew we had to redesign the website, and it unfortunately, the traffic came at a point that we weren't expecting. So we
Mhm.
had a large amount of traffic, and we weren't able to convert. So that was like a wake up call, saying like, hey, like we need a new website that has clear call to actions. It makes it very obvious that we are a daily newsletter, and that there's audience growth that we're not capturing without that website. So it's been a it's been a definitely a friction and sticking point for us.
So let's talk about the business model. So to start with, you're basically running native ads in the newsletter. How's that been so far? What's the demand been at, like, what's the process like?
It's been actually really good so far. A lot of it has been inbound. So if I'm being honest, so we have about six sponsors right now. Most notably, we have Lockheed Martin, who has decided to sponsor with us. So we're just going through our ad inventory for the year, and we're working on a few kind of fairly large proposals for the following year, that I think we're close to the finish line on a number of them, which we're excited about. But yeah, we're just right now focused on filling up the inventory for next year. And our goal is by March or April of next year that we're basically done for the year from a newsletter ad inventory perspective. But of course, we have a number of other products that we're going to be launching. So the podcast, which will be late Q1. Webinars that we're working with a number of sponsors right now to try to figure out what makes the most sense there. Conferences, that's obviously much later on in the timeline. And we're starting to do some events. So we haven't announced this one yet, but in January we're going to be doing a in-person event, a small one in Los Angeles with two very, very, I think, high-profile organizations. So we're excited about that. We've already captured a sponsor for that event, but we're excited to announce that in the coming weeks.
Seems like a jobs board would be an easy slam dunk.
Oh, that's the next priority product. So
Uh-huh.
you're reading our mind. A job board is very, very necessary in the space industry right now. One of the things that we've witnessed is you have all these companies raising hundreds of millions of dollars, and what's the first thing that they need to do when they raise the money? They hire people. What's the first thing that we did? We hired people. So you have a unique situation now where there are many companies that are very well funded and hiring and competing in the same pool of potential candidates of systems engineers, aerospace engineers, marketing people. It's all the same pool, and everyone's competing against one another. And one of the things that we've heard speaking to these companies is that we have to hire all these people, but we think we might hit maybe 25 to 50% of our actual candidate pool for the year, because it's just been a hyper competitive market. And in fact, I was at a conference recently where there was a CEO of a Earth observation business that was asked, hey, what's your biggest hurdle or friction point for growth for your company? And he said, hiring the right people. Right. So that's a very interesting pain point in the industry that we would love to be able to solve. And we think a really good jobs board would be a good kind of first step.
Do you do anything to interact with your readership, either between, you and readers, or allowing them to interact with each other?
So with each other, no, not yet. With us, yes. There's a number of different kind of calls in our newsletters that allow people to interact with us, ask questions, reach out with thoughts, ideas. When we first when you first sign up, you get a welcome letter that kind of asks you a couple questions, that sort of a prompt for people to start engaging with us. So our corporate inbox is like usually filled with people who've come up with questions, thoughts, ideas. And we have a very simple policy at the company, is making sure we answer every single person, no matter what it is, whether it's negative feedback, constructive feedback, positive, whether it's a question about the industry, whether we know it or we don't know it, we're always answering. So we have a really good kind of cadence and dialogue with our readers. But no, to answer your question, we have not they have not interacted with each other quite yet. But of course, like the event in January, I think that'll be one easy way to start doing things like that.
Yeah, but I was thinking also like just a online, some kind of like Facebook group or Slack group or anything like that.
Yeah, we haven't gone that route yet, but it's a good
Uh-huh.
idea.
And then with the podcast, is it just going to be a version of the newsletter where you're just summarizing news, or what are you thinking there?
Yeah, so it will be. We haven't quite decided upon the exact strategy yet, but very likely the first product will be a weekly podcast where we interview someone, interesting, someone senior in the industry, and just do more like a Q&A session on some topic that we think would be great for the industry to hear about. And then I think down the line, I think once we hit a really sizable audience number, like where I'm talking like multiples of where we're at right now, then I think we can think about doing a daily version of the newsletter, right? But what we don't want to do right now is potentially cannibalize readership by creating a product that allows people to choose.
So now that you have like a writer and an editor, how are you and Ari dividing up your roles?
Really, we're focused on audience development, growth, and sales, right? Obviously, for this business model to work, we have to sell ads. So, and it's a lot of work. It's a lot of outreach. And we know that there's going to be a tremendous amount of outreach next year. We've been fortunate that we haven't had to do much of that now because of like just kind of dealing with kind of inbound. But yeah, we're just kind of focused on helping grow that side of the business. And of course, as we launch new products, there's going to be a lot more work to do.
So I talk to a lot of B2B publishers, and like they kind of fall in two different categories. One is like, B2B is perfect for paid subscriptions because, it's a niche that you can differentiate yourself, and, they can justify it more, they can pay more, and they can also expense it because it has to do with their careers. And I talk to some other people and they're like, hell no, I'm not launching a subscription product, at least to start with. It's such a, by having a niche, it's perfect for advertising. You can get these like, high CPM, really targeted native ads that are actually of high value to your readership because they actually care about, the ad as if it wasn't an ad. Seems like you are kind of falling in the second category, at least since your initial business model is around advertising. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what's your idea around subscriptions? Is it something you're going to try to steer away from, or you could see yourself doing it like further down the line? What's your kind of philosophy on that?
So when we first were brainstorming the idea of Payload, we actually were going down the research route, mainly because of my background. We said, well, why don't we
Mhm.
just create a research product? And what we did is we did a ton of user interviews with hedge funds, private equity funds, I think industry professionals that we think would pay for a product like that. And the feedback we got was really simple. Hey, we think that's really cool. We'd love to read it. Not sure if we pay for that yet. So we kind of came to the conclusion that it was a little bit early to start to create like a subscription-based research product. So that's part of the impetus for going down the newsletter route, or pivoting to the newsletter route. And I say pivot, it's not like we were set on going the paid research. We were just exploring it, just trying to see what it would mean. But the paid research product, I think, is a very interesting product. I think it's necessary. I think it's starting to come in demand, and it's on our roadmap. But I would say
So,
not for at least another year.
so instead of like just having a paywall or meter or something like that, you want to do like these big research reports or something like
Exactly.
that, and
Exactly.
charge like $1,000 a year or more.
Yeah, some type of we have to think through the pricing model, because I think one of the interesting things in the aerospace industry right now, which I believe is a bit of an issue or a problem, is that there are research and consulting groups out there that do research, but they charge $12,000 for one research product, or one report. And what ends up happening, and I've realized, because I've actually been on the other side of things, buying research and trying to figure out like, I might need one particular stat or data point on like, I don't know, the SAR satellite industry. And I end up realizing that I have to buy a $12,000 report on, the entire, industry, right? Earth observation industry. And that is a pain point that we've heard from people, and the disintermediation of all that research into more bite-sized pieces that people can actually pay for specifically, or pay on a monthly basis, we think is a different model that I think would be welcomed in the industry.
Okay, Mo, well, those were all the questions I have for you. Where can people find you online?
Easy. So payloadspace.com. And we have a very now obvious subscription link. So we'd love to get more readers. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of exciting things happening in the space. So whether you're an industry professional or you're just a consumer who's interested in what's happening, we'd love to have you as a reader.
Awesome. Well, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, Simon.
Okay, thanks for joining us. I'm actually on the lookout for new guests for this podcast, so if you do interesting stuff in digital content, whether you're a full-time YouTuber, a media executive, or run a cool niche newsletter, definitely reach out. My email address is simonowens@gmail.com. Okay, see you next week.